Well, we're going to start this series, the spring series, with a great lecture by Sarah Conley, who comes to us from Bowdoin. And she's the author of One Child, Do We Have a Right to More?, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. And Against Autonomy, I like the title, I don't know exactly what. Justifying Coercive Paternalism, Cambridge University Press, 2013, and has published op-eds in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and so on, et cetera. She studied philosophy at Princeton and did her graduate work at Cornell, and now teaches philosophy at Bowdoin. So please help me welcome Sarah to the podium.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. May not have been voluntary for the students, but thanks for coming anyway. So I am a 66-year-old philosophy professor at a small school in Mid-Coast, Maine. Not a politician, I'm not an influencer. So I was shocked a few years ago when I started getting hate mail. This is hate email for the most part, but sometimes actual letters. Hate mail telling me I was like Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong. That was most of it. Every now and then they'd branch out a little bit. And this was surprising, you know, because all I do is teach little philosophy classes and write the occasional academic book. But the reason for this relative enmity was that I do argue, as I will argue tonight, that some of the things we think we should have the liberty to do, we shouldn't have the liberty to do. No big deal, except it is true that one of the things I'm going to say we don't have the liberty to do is have as many children as we may happen to want. That we really should have only one child in our particular current situation. And people find that controversial. Go figure. Okay. So when I was a little girl, I went to school in Virginia. And when I was in 4th grade, which would have been 1962, we studied Virginia history, and we learned this speech by Patrick Henry, which ends, "Give me liberty or give me death." And it's ironic at best, tragic at worst, that I was learning this in a segregated school, because schools in Virginia were racially segregated until after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And, you know, I would ride to school on the bus, and you would pass all the little black children, and something happened to them. I'd say most of us didn't really think, you know, why they had to go on a different bus. So it just goes to show, we've always been making choices about who gets liberty to do what. Sometimes we choose really badly, as in the case of racial segregation. And sometimes we choose well. What we do need to do is think about what liberties are important in a given situation and what are not. So this isn't really news. So as long as we're quoting, Oliver Wendell Holmes supposedly said, "My liberty to swing my fist ends at the other man's nose." So there are things you don't have a right to do, like hit somebody in the nose. The problem at present is that things are complicated. Because there are so many of us, on the one hand, our effect as a global population of, at present, about 7.7 billion, our effect on the environment, on other things, is huge, just because there are a lot of us. On the other hand, because there are so many of us, no one of us really makes much difference, because we're only a teeny tiny increment of climate change or habitat disappearance or overpopulation. So this kind of gives us a dilemma. If you individually aren't doing anything wrong by driving your Hummer a block away to McDonald's, do we have a right to stop you? But if we don't, then if everyone says to him or herself, "I'm not doing any harm," then before you know it, we get real environmental harm. So one problem is this problem of increments. What do you do when there's a big harm, but it's created by a lot of individual people, no one of which is doing something terribly bad? The second problem, which is not just a contemporary one, is when exactly does the harm I'm doing mean that I really should be stopped? Because I could do harm in a number of ways. I could wear really ugly clothes, and everywhere I go, people go, oh, yeah. But most people would say I have a right to do that. You know, it's self-expression, suck it up, she likes to wear whatever you don't like, you know, I'm wearing it. So we have to think about that. It's pretty obvious if it's punching someone in the nose, but there are other cases where it's not so obvious. When we think I should be stopped, is going to be partly a function of what liberty I'm using, the liberty of self-expression, which allows me to wear pink and purple polka dots. And it's partly what liberty I'm infringing on, if there is one. So do you have a liberty not to be visually assaulted? Maybe not. Other cases, you may have certain liberties. But again, we might say, well, sorry, you know, you're just going to have to give that up because what so-and-so is doing is more important. So we need to figure out that trade-off along with the incremental issue. So we need to change, and I'm going to favor, in many cases, governmental regulation. Why? This addresses the first issue, the incremental change. That is, there's a coordination problem. So I might say to myself, look, I wouldn't drive my Hummer to Hannaford if I thought it would help the environment for me to walk, but it's not going to help because everyone else is driving. So what's the point? Fair enough. When it comes to something like that, what a government can provide is coordination. Now, the government, naturally, doesn't want to arrest everyone who drives Hummers to Hannaford or drives anything to Hannaford. But what they can do is disincentivize, as we say, driving, so they can have a gas tax. Makes it more expensive, you're less liable to do it. They can have governmentally applied CAFE standards. That is, the CAFE standards are fuel efficiency standards that the fleet as a whole, that all the car manufacturers have to meet. And for a while that was going up. That is, they had to be more efficient. Under the present regime, not so much. But the government can do that kind of thing. They're not going to chase you down and arrest you. It's just providing a framework that makes it more liable that you will not drive, and not just you, but everyone, and thus we together do less towards pollution. Now, I think we need to do a lot more of that, but that's a case where at least we've done a little. So far, maybe so good. It gets trickier, though. People do like to drive, but I don't know that they are, for the most part, really heartfelt about driving a block to Hannaford's, unless they have a disability, and that would be a whole different thing. Those people, of course, could do it. But there are things we do care about. One of the things we care about is having children. Not everybody, right? Some people are like, you know, please no, anything but that. But lots of people do want to have children. And in itself, there's nothing wrong with that desire. You know, you have a child, you have someone you love, you raise them, they love you, hopefully. It's great. The problem is that when each of us little increments is doing our harmless activity, it results, apparently now, in overpopulation. That is, now I'm going to talk about facts, and there are people who dispute them, and if there's no overpopulation problem, great, I'm psyched. Then we don't have to worry about whether you have a right to have more than one child. But if there is an overpopulation, we do. So I'm going to address that. So as some of you probably know, the global population at present is around 7.7 billion. I say around because during that sentence, people were born, but roughly that. The present prediction by the United Nations, and pretty much the same by the United States Census Bureau, is that by the year 2050, which is during the lifetime of many of you guys, not me, lucky, but many of you guys, the population is going to reach 9.6 billion. So where we are now, 7.7 billion is more than we've ever had. 9.6 billion is a whole lot more. By the year 2100, which could be reached by one of those babies that was just born a minute ago, the estimated population is going to be 11.2 billion. That's a lot of people. Nobody, well, I'm going to go out on a limb, nobody reputable thinks it's going to be easy to survive with a population of 11.2 billion people. There are lots of things. There is a shortage of arable soil. We're already getting that, even in the United States, and we're pretty well off, but a huge loss of soil in the Midwest because it's been overused, basically, too much agriculture. We're having not enough fresh water, partly because there's more of us using it, so there's less per person. Part of it because of drought cycles. It's not falling in it's falling in the ocean rather than on the land, so we don't have fresh water to use. There's just a ton of problems, shortage of precious minerals, obviously climate change. So everyone just about agrees this is a real issue. Not only will there be these shortages, but when there are shortages, what you tend to get is violence, civil unrest, as they say. People steal from one another if they don't have enough. Countries go to war with one another over oil, hypothetically. So this just looks like a bad situation. Now, a lot of people point out correctly that the fertility rate has fallen. It's been falling for over 20 years. So the fertility rate is how many children a woman on average has over her lifetime. And at this point, in the world as a whole, the fertility rate is 2.5. Not a lot of people having that 0.5 child. But when you average out how many children people have around the world, the average is 2.5. If we just wanted, well, in some situations, if you wanted to replace the current population, you could manage that with just having 2 children for 2 parents, right? You'd have the 2 parents, they'd have 2 kids, and things would be stable. You really have to have 2.1, but never mind. The problem right now is that even if each of us, well, not me, but you young people, just had 2 children, the population will still go up. The fertility rate has fallen. The birth rate, which is how many kids are born per 1,000 people, has fallen. But the population is still rising and is predicted to rise, again, until at least 2100. Why is that? Speaking as an old person, there are too many young people. That is, we have what is called a demographic bulge. There's way more young people than there are old people. That means you have something called demographic momentum. Even if all us old people die and the young people just have 2 kids per couple, we're going to get more people. It's like if you had 2 grandparents with 8 grandchildren. The grandparents would die, but if each of those 8 grandchildren has children, the population goes up. It doesn't stay even. So if we had an exact same number of people in every generation, we'd be golden. If you had 2 kids, fertility rate around the world, we'd be good. But we don't have that. We got all these young people. Naturally, they want to have children. Their kids want to have children, etc. So the United Nations, surprise, is aware of the fact that the fertility rate has fallen. Their estimate of 11.2 billion is based on the belief that not only will that fertility rate stay low, it will actually get lower. If it doesn't get lower, the population will be higher. Okay, so this is an incremental problem. That is, no one of us makes a big difference, but it's still a problem. Is it, though, the kind of harm from which other people should be protected? Or is our right to procreate more important? Right? You remember, I could wear ugly clothes even though that hurt you, because we said, well, too bad. She has this right to self-expression. You might say, I don't care what the population's going to be. I have a right to procreate. I might choose to have fewer. I might not choose to have fewer, but it's nobody's business but mine. You could say that. But if you said that, I would ask you to justify the claim. I am a philosophy professor, which is why people hate me. I'm always asking people, justify what you're saying. Because when we say you have a right, like a right to free speech, a right to procreation, a right to wear ugly clothes, you have to back that up. There are reasons we believe people have rights. One thing we think is that you do, all things being equal, have a right to self-expression, so like the right to free speech. So you can go around and say all sorts of mean things to people that hurt them. You're ugly, you're dumb, you have the most boring class I've ever had. You have the right to say those things. They're hurtful, but we think, well, self-expression, we need that. It's not very nice of you, but we wouldn't haul you off and put you in jail. And that's really because we think, well, a lot of things, you can't have a democracy without free speech, can't have communication without free speech, can't even, some people think straight unless you're able to express yourself, and so forth. The question is whether we have a right to procreation of the same sort. What would life be like if you only had one child? Not that bad. Lots of people have one child as it is. Lots of people have no children as it is, either because they didn't want to or because other things intervened. To deprive someone of the right to have more than one child is not, for most people, to take away something that is vital to a decent life. And I know that may sound horrible, especially to people with lots of kids. And if you think of the children you have, those of you who have children, and you think, well, which one would I want to give up? For most people, that's a very unattractive proposition. You don't say, well, I guess it's going to be this one. That would be painful. But no one is talking about taking away people's children. So the question isn't how would you feel if someone took away your child, or one of your children, or two of your children. You'd feel horrible. The question is how you feel about the children you didn't have. And how awful is that you didn't have them. And it's nothing like losing a child that you have. So you don't want to think about the loss as being a loss of my son Owen, whom I love. You want to think about being, well, at this age, I don't even know how many children I could have had if I put my mind to it. Let's say 10. But I'm not saying, oh my gosh, I really miss Griselda, Amy, Barron, I don't know, all these people. So yeah, we don't want to go around and kill people, just as we don't want people in the future to be at war or dying for not having enough food or for not having enough water. So a right to procreation, yeah, I can see a right to procreation, that is, a right to have a child. We do want the human race to continue. But a right to something doesn't necessarily entail you have a right to as many of that thing as you might happen to want. A lot of people think we have a right to food. And I'm fine with that, yeah, supply food. That doesn't mean you have a right to lobster and champagne. Doesn't mean you have a right just to whatever you might want. It means you have a right to have your basic needs met. A lot of people would say the same for health care. Many people think nowadays that we have a right to health care, but that doesn't mean just anything. It's going to depend how much it costs, how much it matters to you, how much it matters to the other person. And so we know in England where they have national health care, they prioritize. You don't necessarily get cosmetic surgery if you're a normal-looking person who just wants to look better, not paid for by the state. Now, if you're in an accident, that's a different thing. So The fact that you have a right to have a child, because for many people, having some sort of child, and for some people having a biological child, I don't know why, but it is, having a biological child is really important, doesn't mean you have a right to just as many as you want, because you don't need that for a decent life, and we don't need that for a decent country or globe. At the same time, having too many children does take away the liberties of those who are going to live in the future. They are not going to have enough food or enough education or enough housing. They are really going to suffer so that you could have something that you didn't really need. So that basically is the way the argument goes. Not all liberties are equally important. What liberties you should have depends a bit on the effect of exercising that liberty. Does it deprive other people of more important liberties, or does it not? That changes with circumstances. There was a time at which going out there and having all the kids you want was no problem. I mean, there might have been you should be able to take care of them and so forth, but it wasn't an environmental problem. Now it is. So just as we rethink, what sort of transportation you use and speed limits and all sorts of safety mechanisms, once circumstances are changed and we need those, I think this is a case where we need a change. What should we do? Everyone says, okay, so you're going to kidnap people off the streets and give them forced abortions? No. I mean, that would be stupid, if nothing else. Imagine a time when there weren't any speed limits, which there must have been this time. And then at some point after cars were invented and people started getting killed, someone said, I think we need to limit how fast people go, and we'll have different speed limits according to if you're in a city or if you're in the country and if you can see what's coming, and all of that kind of thing. Someone says we need to lose our liberty to go as fast as we want. And the other person says, well, how are you going to do that? The only way you can literally stop them from going fast is to shoot them, when they're speeding down the road. That would be a terrible idea. Yes, it would. But we have discovered you don't need to use that kind of coercion. When it comes to speed limits, we do use some coercion. That is, we have tickets, traffic tickets. We also use education, though. So we educate you. Most people know there's a reason for the speed limits. It's not just random cruelty that when you're late to the airport, you have to slow down. There's a reason for that. And of course, there's a reason also for the coercive part. That is, the threat of a speeding ticket. Because if we leave you to make your own judgment, often people don't judge that well. I have known many people who say, well, most people shouldn't go over 70, but I personally, I could go 110, no problem. Some of these are the people who say, I drive better drunk than most people do sober. When we recognize a problem, like that some people go too fast, it isn't enough really to leave it to us to decide. I've talked to people who've said, sure, some people should only have one child. I, though, am one of those people whose genes are so awesome that I should have multiple children. And of course, no one else agrees. So I think it is a case where we do want education, about population and what we think is going to happen. But we also need the disincentives and incentives. So I think not grabbing people off the street and executing or giving them forced abortions or any of that stuff. You could give, for example, people a tax break if they have fewer children. You could give people a tax penalty if they have more than one children. Money is very effective. As a matter of fact, that we know that when the fertility rate has fallen and risen in the US, a lot of that has correlated with whether we're in a depression or whether the economy is growing. And that wasn't the government doing anything, it was just people didn't have enough money to have more kids. Probably part of the reason that the American fertility rate is below 2 right now, it's 1.8, is that it's expensive to have kids. Women are working. You don't have a stay-at-home parent. College costs a ton. Money makes a difference to people. I think if we educated people and those people who already have access to contraception were incentivized or disincentivized financially, that would make a difference. There are places where basically the money may not make a difference, but those are also places where right now there's often no ability to control your procreation. That is, a lot of people in the world don't have access to contraception. So you can't really blame them if they have more than one child. In that case, rather than the money, I would say the first thing you could do is supply contraception to people. That is quite a cheap thing to do. I mean, personally, I would supply all sorts of medical help to people who are in places who don't have access to medicine. But free contraception and contraception that's local, that's easy to get, makes a huge difference. Some of the places with the highest fertility rates are in sub-Saharan Africa, and not surprisingly, these are the places that have almost no medical care. I mean, literally places where there's one doctor for 1 million people. I mean, that sounds hard to believe, but it's actually true. So, yeah, if you leave nature to its own devices, you're going to have kids. But if you gave people contraception, you know, the first stage would at least be they could choose what they want to do. And that in itself would be a huge help. So I would say education, free contraception for anyone who needs it in the US or elsewhere, not only free but convenient. You got to be able to get it. And then if we need more, if we need incentives and disincentives of a financial nature, I would be fine with that, because I don't think it violates a right, because I don't think you have a right to do something that is going to cause so much harm to people in the future, to deprive them of so many liberties, when doing without that wouldn't hurt you that much. So this is why I get hate mail. So thank you very much. I'm done.